And this is a celebration of Audrey Trainor's promotion from assistant professor to associate professor. Some words about Dr. Trainor. Audrey got her bachelor's degree in linguistics with an emphasis in Spanish in 1989, a master's in special education from North Carolina Greensboro in 1996, and graduated from the University of Texas, Austin in 2003 with an emphasis in multiculturalism and linguistics and special education. She comes to us, she came to Madison in 2004, achieved tenure in fall 2010, and again, congratulations. Audrey's research emphasizes, provides us a greater context and a texture to the fabric, if you will, in terms of the interface of multiculturalism and diversity and cultural values in special education. And I think that qualitative emphasis with her knowledge and quantitative really provides us with a much deeper and richer knowledge. Thank you to her contributions. Audrey is on the IRB committee for School of Education. She is currently co-chair of Equity and Diversity. She is chair of the special education area. So as I said, upon achieving tenure, we have asked her to wear a lot of hats, and we thank her for being a great citizen of the university and the School of Education and Rehab Psych and Special Education. So without further ado, Dr. Audrey Trainor.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Associate Dean Huffler. I just want to take a minute also to thank other people in the room and also some people who aren't here today. But first of all, it is an honor and a privilege to get tenure here, so I'm very appreciative and happy about that fact. I would like to give a special thank you to Kimber Wilkerson because she was the person in charge of putting my case up, and she did that on her sabbatical year. So it was a big commitment, and I really appreciate that. I'd also like to thank all of the members of the RPSC department because I felt very supported over the years, and that made, I think, a great difference in just my ability to get what I needed to get done. And then in addition to that, also my informal and formal mentors, which I think is a very important thing that we're going to touch on later today, or later in the topic. And then also, of course, friends and family, and many of those friends are in the room. But I was hoping that my husband, Trey Furr, would make it today, and he might be on the way over, but I would like to have a special thanks just for him because he's been very supportive. Now that the pressure is off, at least a little bit, I'm going to try something new today, and hopefully it won't fail, but I'm going to try to use Prezi, a presentation software that's competing with PowerPoint. And it's supposed to help you construct a presentation in a nonlinear way. So we will all be the judge of that. And their one caveat in their user manual, it's free by the way if you use a web-based version, but their one caveat is it can cause motion sickness. So hopefully nobody will need any accommodations for that. Okay, so my topic, oops, I should probably read my title. Shaping a research trajectory, tenure, and the competing demands for high productivity and evidence. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the major thesis is that the combined demands of high productivity and scientific evidence are points of leverage in the development of a research trajectory. And then that leads me to ask the question, what might those points of leverage be? And then, does it matter? Or why does it matter? How does it matter? And so this is sort of my depiction of my path, my trajectory from the beginning to the end, or to the end, which is really a beginning. It doesn't seem right, obviously, to think about it as an end. And really, we're going to focus on 2 points. One, or we'll focus on a multiple number of points, but it's hard to think of going from point A to point B in a very straight line. So you'll see lots of jumps along the way. And I would like to begin at the beginning, which was 2004. And I came to the university obviously prepared for action, but that was just August. And one of the things that I really tried to, or one of the things that I tried to incorporated my general research interests that had to do with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disabilities. And those were disabilities that I worked with most as a high school teacher. So between my bachelor's and my master's and leaving to get my PhD, I was a high school teacher for about 10 years in North Carolina. And that really got me interested in post-secondary transition, issues of what happens when kids with disabilities move into adulthood. And the area of self-determination quickly emerged as something that was considered to be a best practice or a promising practice for people with disabilities. And that was really interesting to me because I could remember sort of dragging kids in high school to their IEP meetings, which is where this self-determination was supposed to be practiced. So there was a lot of dissonance between what was good for kids and what kids wanted and what self-determination might actually mean. And then particularly in the context of culture, I thought that it posed some very interesting issues, how parents related to their children, how children related to teachers in front of parents, etc. So the beginning, this was the beginning, 2004, but of course the beginning is never that easy to identify. So a little bit of backstory. I studied with Alba Ortiz at the University of Texas, and Alba is a very strong Latina scholar who studies bilingual issues in special education. But again, it just reinforced some of the questions that I was already forming about self-determination, because everything that she does as a scholar, and the department has a multicultural and bilingual area in special education, everything is really seen through a cultural lens, whether it's teaching and learning or research itself as a cultural practice. And so that's part of what I brought. I also brought some tools. In the bag are probably the typical tools. I hope nobody's getting motion sickness. Typical tools associated with interviewing, so some digital recorders, pens, pencils, etc. But being in the field to me really meant using some pretty commonplace items. And also my ideas and beliefs, really what people probably call epistemology, my understanding of the way the world works, what we should be doing in research, how to do it, and then of course background about special education and the extant literature itself. And in particular, in relation to transition and self-determination. So coinciding with my first step into the field as a researcher, unbeknownst to me, although these were articles I read, but I probably didn't know their import at the time. And so at the same time was this wave of reformation in educational research, and it was beginning to proliferate the airwaves of universities, other research settings, and fields of practice. And this was the call for evidence-based practices that was made from many prominent scholars in both education writ large and from special education. So that's a whole nother presentation. But briefly, the important thing to take away, or the important thing that I've taken away from this, is that these calls for evidence-based research or evidence-based practices, and the idea, the way that evidence is constructed, has been very, it's had a great influence in the field of educational research. And so just a few examples of these are the papers that I have up here. One is a very well-known paper by Robert Slavin that was published in 2002 or 2003. And then in special education, there is a lot of work from Samuel Odom and colleagues who are very influential scholars in our subfield that really honed in on the notion of scientific research. So Slavin, and he spoke to a broader audience, but he had a very strong appeal to special education scholars, and he focused on, in particular, the replicability and the efficiency of experimental research in education, and called the hallmark of validity a research design that includes the implementation of a control group. And this, you know, for people who are in special education, this was a little bit of a shocker, because we think of disability as being individually manifested. So the idea that there's a control group presents some interesting considerations, and it could be problematic. And then also because there is a notion that there might be some social construction of disability, which doesn't mean that disability doesn't exist, but it's a way of broadening the understanding of what the implications of having a different ability or a disability might be in a person's everyday life. So those two things were sort of in conflict with, or maybe not in conflict, that might be too strong to think about, but the idea of a control group made it very complicated. Odom and colleagues started in the Division of Research of our National Special Education Organization newsletter, and they laid out in 2004 groundwork for identifying or generating evidence through research. What counted as good research? And they identified later in the article from 2005, they identified the notion that randomized control experiments were the gold standard. And they call it the gold standard, and they explain that other methods of research are important, but that was the gold standard. And then Gersten and colleagues in the same issue said, and this is a quote, and he's talking really about, or they are talking about the Scientific Research and Education report that came out from Shavelson and Town. It's a well-known report about reforming education. That there's no reason why education should not be subject to the same scientific methods as other disciplines such as chemistry or physics. And so that's a lot to think about. So those two things coincided, and really the latter focused on the rigor or the randomized control experiments, and also interventions that work, sort of was on that same trajectory. So from there, you know, somewhat naively, I have this set of tools for interpretivism, and I enter this world that is really asking for a different type of knowledge to be generated, a different type of evidence. But at the time, like I say, I was pretty naive, and I didn't. It did not necessarily bother me because I had done some dissertation research about self-determination, and I understood that I really wanted to think about how youth with disabilities and their families interpreted their experiences in relation to being self-determining as they left high school and moved to adulthood. And this was a particularly pertinent topic because the outcomes for kids in high school with disabilities are very, generally speaking, poor in comparison to their peers without disabilities. So at that point, the other thing that was going on was that OSERS, which is the special ed, at that time was what the special ed office sponsored research called for the development of self-determination curricula. And so there were a number of curricula that were developed in the late 90s that were being then studied and applied in the early 2000s. And so from my perspective, as I looked at those and compared them to the work that I had done with the people I included in my dissertation study, I noticed that the universal notion of self-determination might be difficult to come by. And there were different ideas about how to define self-determination and how to implement it or practice it. And so these research questions are present in my early work. Basically, I'm looking at the cultural interpretation of self-determination and then how the interpretation might influence acting with causal agency, which is the most typical definition that you see in special education. And I keep bringing up special ed because it actually is a different definition than its originators in psychology. If you're familiar with Ryan and Desi's work, it's been adapted and practicalized for the implementation in real-world contexts. And so I set off to do some qualitative work, and I got some done. I found out that the opportunities, and I thought this was very interesting. I did 2 studies. The studies involved both boys and girls separately, and I interviewed them, and I observed their IEP meetings, and I also did a document review of their IEPs. And the young women and men had one thing in common in particular, and that had to do with the fact that the opportunities to practice self-determination at school were very few or infrequent. And that the youth perceived their parents to be encouraging of self-determination, which was interesting because the literature wasn't quite clear on that. So there was this notion that if you were from a collectivist culture, for example, your parents might not be as encouraging of self-determination, but it wasn't necessarily what I found out in interviews. So that was an interesting finding. And then the observations revealed that there were a lot of power and status issues and structural barriers to self-determination, to the practice of self-determination. So a very quick example would be a young man who asked to take Spanish. He had a learning disability and he wanted to take a second language. He said, my goal is to go to college. I know I need a second language. My sister goes to Spanish class. I need it. And the teachers consulted one another and said, he's not going to make it. And they unenrolled him. And, you know, so he and I had a very rich conversation about the choice to take it, and then also coming to school and finding that it's not included in your schedule. And I call that a structural issue, or a difference between power and status of a student, a youth, and a teacher. And let's see. Because I was approaching the topic from the point of view of being an interpretivist, I also devoted a lot of time to constructing research methods that would foster trust and authentic and trustworthy cross-cultural communication with participants and myself. I'm, first of all, a woman. I was interviewing young boys. I don't have a learning disability. There were differences in race, ethnicity, because I was interested in doing a cross-group comparison. So I thought a lot about how to promote the relationship that I had with the students as I engaged in research, which, as you can imagine, is time-consuming. I repeated that study with young girls with disabilities, and then at the point at which I realized that there were these structural barriers, I continued to have some curiosity about this and wanted to know more about that. What is keeping kids from getting opportunities to practice self-determination? And you know, this connected to the data because that was a predominant theme of both of the studies as I had conceptualized them originally. So the adolescents and then I also wanted to know how do parents' status in the IEP meetings reflect self-determination? And that question, that shifting between adolescent and parent, really came from the notion that in those observations, what I saw oftentimes, unfortunately, was that parents were disrespected in meetings. And so then my mind started asking, if you go to a meeting and you're expected to say, well, I'd like to take this such and such a class or do such and such a whatever, and even your parent isn't listened to, I'm not sure that you would feel the freedom to speak up and be listened to as well. And so that's how I got the idea to think about where parents are in this whole thing. That also really strongly connected back to ethnographic methods, because I recognized that I needed a stronger theoretical link to understand what was cultural about this. So at the same time that I was wondering about these structural barriers, I was also really struggling with the meaning of culture, which actually isn't a construct that's well defined or singularly defined across, at least not interdisciplinarian. And so I was interested in more questions, and that actually led me to look for a theoretical underpinning, to look for something that would help me understand and explain this. Now, one thing that's important to know about special education is, and I think this has maybe been said about education writ large, but very clearly comment in special education often that we are not clearly tied to a theoretical underpinning, or that our research does not take time to explicitly state a theoretical underpinning. And so it's unusual, it's somewhat unusual to go to a theorist and to couch a special ed presentation of research that way. But I really thought that it was appropriate given these past concerns that I've just described. So I was led to Pierre Bourdieu by some people in special education who had very brief mentions that there might be something going on here with social reproduction, with the notion of cultural and social capital. And to me, that made sense. It made sense to think that sometimes if you don't have access to information, either explicit or implicit, either material or immaterial, knowledge, the way things go, the way things work, processes, or if you don't have connections to the right people, you might not be able to meet your goal. And so that certainly resonated with some of my interests. I think everybody is probably familiar with Bourdieu. He's certainly not an outlier. He's written lots and lots. He's a prolific writer. But an interesting thing about him as a theorist is that he is also an empirist. I mean, he went out into the field and collected data quite a bit. And his work, it really took me, I would say, a better part of a year after having started my assistantship to learn this theory, to really absorb it and to understand it in a well enough way that I could then try to possibly apply it or to think about how it might be useful in my field. So once that I felt that I had done enough of that, which is, I have to say, a little anxiety, as an assistant, to think about sitting around and reading produced a lot of anxiety for me because I needed to get out there, and I knew that. So as soon as I was ready, I went forward, and I decided to, like Bourdieu, return to the field and use some of the tools for which I had begun to develop some expertise in, and which continued to suit the research questions that I wanted to answer. I did change the focus of my work to parents, as I mentioned, and this also was a theoretical issue in addition to the other issues that I mentioned, because Bourdieu is very concerned about the generational transformation of capital from parent to child, grandparent, et cetera, on the generation. So I was interested in thinking about parents, and after I was able to get a theory piece out, I went into the field again and did 2 additional studies. And this time they were both limited to qualitative interviews. And I do consider this that juncture, one of those junctures or points of leverage in the way that my work developed and evolved over time, in part because in the first 2 studies I had a richer ethnographic design. And so I was doing observations, I was doing document reviews, and that is considered an issue of quality in qualitative work, that you have multiple ways to look at your data, you have multiple ways to answer your question, and multiple points for analysis in particular. But at this point, it's, I think, probably going on year 3 at this point, or year 4, beginning of year 4, and I knew that I needed to get something done, and so I chose to do interviews. Now, I will say that that's a pragmatist view, and it's, we could debate it. But I also do think there were some other practical issues, one of which is that observing IEP meetings when parents are participating is a real-world activity. It has real-world consequences. And so I think there were some ethical issues that led me to feel okay about just doing the interviews after the fact. So I did group interviews and individual interviews. And again, I'm still struggling with the notion of culture, so I'm going to do a cross-group comparison with the parents. And this particular study included 27 parents originally. I asked parents, or I allowed parents or invited parents to invite other loved ones who were important influences in the lives of their child. And so that ended up to be about 33 adults, and they were considering, or they were talking about 36 children. So some families had multiple children in special education, and that made for very interesting conversations. As I said, I was doing cross-group comparison, so the participants were in the racial and ethnic categories of Black, White, Latino, and American Indian. And I was still struggling with how to know what about this is identity-driven, what about this is cultural, what about this has to do with structure, and specifically I was asking about the acquisition and use of capital. And so I didn't really give a good definition of it earlier, but basically it's, again, that information, those social connections that people use to get what they need. So, and I should say that it's not as purposeful as all that. So it's not like going to the shopping, to the grocery store and picking up what you need. Sometimes you don't know that that's what you need, but you dress up when you go to a certain setting because you want to command certain attention, etc. So it's a highly complex construct. And I wanted to focus not only on race and ethnicity, because at least by this point I started to understand that race and culture can't be conflated. So we need to think about culture much more broadly, and I wanted to consider socioeconomic background and also disability of the child, because I had a hunch or a hypothesis that for some groups, and this really goes back to the extant literature, for example, parents of youth with autism are very tightly connected with one another, at least that's what the literature was saying, and so they had strong networks of helping them get help. And I wasn't sure that that was so true for disabilities that maybe were socially unacceptable, like bad behavior or disabilities that relate to behavior and social skill difficulties and challenges. The teacher study, so the 2 papers came from that study, and one of them is entirely about advocacy. And one of the beauties about qualitative work, I think, is the ability to go into the field and not really know what you'll find and to discover it. And I didn't ask questions originally about advocacy, but advocacy is what emerged. A very strong story of parent advocacy that was not always congruent with the extant literature, in the sense that, as I point out, the definition of advocacy is contested, and it was instantiated with beliefs and values associated with the dominant group. But that although cultural capital in particular was necessary for people to participate, it wasn't always sufficient. And for those of you who don't have a lot of background in special ed, basically the short version or the Reader's Digest version of this would be that in our major policy, we say parents will come and participate. They'll come to the table and participate and say, I need my child to have this class or this accommodation or this modification. And that we as a special ed community will say, yes, thank you for coming. Let's get that right, let's get it working. And yet we all know from this extant literature that there's often problem with that setup, that people don't get what they ask for. Or maybe from the other perspective, they might ask for something that's unreasonable. So there's some tension there. And, when I say that cultural capital is necessary but not sufficient, there were plenty of times where people came with lawyers, with information, with lots of stuff in their cultural capital bag, if you will, and they still didn't feel that they got their needs met. Now, at this point, I'm just talking to families, so I can't really attest to the fact that they weren't getting that their rights were not being met, because I think that we would have to really understand, again, go back to ethnographic methods, talk to teachers, find out from schools, look at policy and think what is reasonable. If you go to school and ask for, the best laptop in town, that might not be reasonable for a school to provide, even if someone really thinks that would make their child's life better. So the other side of this was then to go to the teacher. And so I wanted to do a teacher study, and it was extremely difficult to get off the ground. There was very little teacher interest, even though it was an incentivized research, just like my previous studies had been with parents. But when I did get the chance to finally interview teachers, I did ask them. I thought a lot of teachers would want to talk about this, and they would just say, no, no, we don't want to talk about this anymore. It's a very difficult topic, and we also feel that we kind of know what we're doing in this area. We know how to involve parents, but that's another story, because at this point in my trajectory, it's still not going very far. And so then I entered the tunnel. There's light at the end of the tunnel, so tunnels aren't a terrible place to be, but I will say that the voices from the field that were really focused on intervention research were, and in particular randomized control experiments, were really, really becoming louder and more forceful in the field and saying, look, we've got to know what works. We've got to have good intervention research that just tells us what practices are replicable, what we can do to help children with disabilities learn, because of course the outcomes all the while are not getting any better. And so that was loud. And one of the effects of that was that funding for small scale studies was, those funds have dried up. I mean, I think most people probably in this room know about that. And so funding was limited. And in particular at conferences, I would go where, to the new scholar breakfast, and they would tell you how to get published. And again, I would hear the same reinforcing message: get us some intervention research. And so thus I entered the tunnel. So I knew I needed to speed things up. And I knew I needed to get highly productive. And I also knew that I needed to, if I was going to make a name for myself, and I think that's one of the things about tenure, one of the few criteria that are really explicitly stated, is that you need a national reputation. So if I was going to build this evidence, I needed to think about collaborating and working in another design. And I think, again, this is one of those junctures where my work really, really changed. So the teacher study, it had to go on the back burner. I couldn't do all things at once. I will say that paper is still under review. So probably that's why it's a Word document icon instead of a PDF. But luckily for me, and I think also for Eric, I think it was a mutually collaborative relationship. Eric Carter and I, who was a colleague here at RPSE, but who is now at Vanderbilt, we received an IES grant to develop an intervention that addressed transition-related employment and self-determination and strengths and needs for youth with disabilities. And we focused on two populations. So we focused on youth with emotional and behavioral disabilities and learning disabilities in the early stages, which were my areas of interest and expertise. And then his area of interest and expertise were youth with significant intellectual and developmental disabilities. Just check the time here. Okay. Let's see. The first phase of this particular study, so let me just go through. So I found this, collaborative project. We did get some funding, a lot of funding actually. It was a 3-year project and that was nice. We also knew that we were going to, and we proposed to include a randomized control experiment and to look at some descriptive quantitative measures. And we also proposed a secondary analysis of a large-scale database, which is a national database that tracks the progress and outcomes of youth with disabilities called the NLTS2. And very interesting to me because I still had all of these interests in cultural issues and issues of equity specifically. Very interesting to me was that the reports for the NLTS2 were coming out saying that kids with disabilities they were improving a lot, which was great. Their employment rates were up, not equitable to their peers without disabilities, but that there were no differences across groups based on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status and gender. And so that was really shocking because that didn't really mirror the general population. So we wanted to get in there and look at that data and to better understand how that might be the case. And so the first phase of the study, these are the major findings from part of the study. The first phase of the study included about 300 Wisconsin youth, and we measured and described their self-determination, their transition skills, and their work experiences. And then in the second phase, we implemented a 5-component intervention that focused on increasing summer work opportunities for youth. Underlying these components to the intervention were the theoretical ties to culture and social capital. So for example, we had as one of the components a specific person who was responsible for connecting the youth and their transition planning to local employers in their communities. And we did a lot of community building exercises that we considered a component of that transition, and we called them community conversations. So we invited businessmen, or business people, we invited employers, people from employment agencies, service providers, teachers, youth, their families, everyone to come together and to consider this problem. Why is it that youth with disabilities have a difficult time finding employment? And so that's just one example of 5 components, but that made up the intervention. And then in the third phase of the project, we conducted the secondary analysis of the large-scale database. And originally we had designed that to be a foregrounder of this project, but because things get moving really fast and intervention work is really, really fast, we knew that we had to put that on the back burner, and we came back and looked later and then tried to think, how is the group nationally doing compared to what we found here in Wisconsin? Some of the findings that we arrived at from these studies include that the strongest predictor for employment for youth with significant intellectual disabilities was their spring employment. So, that's the other thing I forgot to mention. We were looking at summer employment. Summer is this great opportunity. And so if they were already employed in the spring, they were more likely to be employed in the summer. And, in some ways, and I think this is kind of funny about intervention research, in some ways it's like, well, duh, right? Okay, so they kept getting employed, they kept being employed, right? But really what it was about was that they had lots of employment finding supports in the spring because it was during the school year. And that's very interesting. And then also that teachers' expectations were one of the highest predictors of whether or not the kids found summer jobs, not their work readiness skills, which is interesting because almost all of what we do in vocational ed targets work readiness skills. So that was an interesting finding. We also found that teachers and parents valued self-determination for the population, significant intellectual disabilities, and that their beliefs correlated with the students' social skills. And not much work had been done with significant intellectual disabilities and self-determination. That's the group of kids for whom choices are most often made. In part because they might have significant communication disabilities or significant intellectual disabilities. So that was interesting. Also, teachers and parents identified different component self-determination capacities and opportunities of youth with varying disabilities differently. And what that really is an incredibly long sentence trying to say that the perception of disability did influence the perception of self-determination. And then we also, as part of all of this, surveyed Chamber of Commerce because we were really trying to incorporate them in this networking effort. And it was a very interesting survey. Basically, one half of the sample received one survey and the other half received another survey. And the only difference on those surveys is that One survey said with youth with disabilities after each item. So the item might be, how feasible would it be to hold a job fair at your local high school? And then there was a Likert type scale. And then the other survey that went to the other half of the sample said, how feasible would this be to hold this job fair with youth with disabilities at your local high school? And what we found was that the Chamber of Commerce was, the members who answered the survey were really conceptualizing of these networking experiences as part of their job. I mean, that was clear. It came through in the surveys that they conceptualized the idea of working with schools as being very important, but on every item for the survey that said with youth with disabilities, the response rate was much more on the low end of the Likert scale in terms of, do you think this is feasible? Do you think it's important? Do you already do it? And so that really gave us a window into something that needs some work. Another thing that we found out was youth with significant intellectual disabilities who received our intervention. So this was an efficacy of the intervention. We did a study that showed that they were significantly more likely to be employed in the summer. So this is a whole nother study. I mean, you know, I could talk about that for an hour, but the bottom line is this 5-component intervention had some import in the lives of these kids, and that was very exciting. For the youth with emotional and behavioral disabilities, however, there were gains, but they were not significant. And so that's, you know, one of the things that we tried to think about is why, what supports varied or what was needed that was different. And we did a lot of qualitative work that we think informs that experiment. And you'll see, so one thing I just point out is, you know, I think it's like 10 papers came from this side of the quantitative analysis and the discussion of that. Which, as I said, it was very fast and things were coming out rapidly. Looking at the measurement of self-determination, for example, took very little time. But the qualitative work tended to be a little bit different. One of the studies has to do with teachers. So in these qualitative findings, we found that while teachers supported the idea of summer employment, they identify essential infrastructure and resources that impact the social validity of the intervention. Well, that's a very fancy way of saying they were like, are you kidding me? I'm not working in the summer. Don't expect us to do that. Don't suggest that, right? And so we talked about, and some teachers said, you know, I would be happy to do this, but make sure you pay me. And so, you know, and of course that being reasonable, but one of the things that we were wondering about is, do teachers think this is an important time? Because one of our hypotheses is actually that you could affect summer employment in the spring. You didn't have to wait. In fact, if you wait till summer, it's probably too late. Most kids know what they're doing before school lets out. And so, you know, we wanted to think about that because for youth with disabilities, and we also hypothesize this might be true for youth with emotional and behavioral disabilities, they might need coaching along the way. So we might very well need that paid person in the summer to check in to make sure things are going okay at work. The perceptions of youth with emotional and behavioral disabilities from low socioeconomic backgrounds did think that summer was not only desirable, but in many cases it was essential for their family income. So there's a lot of discussion about how there's high pressure to get a summer job, and a lot of discussion about the frustration of not understanding why they weren't the one picked for the jobs that they applied. And so that's one of the things that we talked a lot about in terms of the interviews and focus groups, and really tried to tease out what supports might directly address that. Also, that the perception of youth across disabilities supported self-determination and employment. They really, as I said, wanted that, but they did identify challenges that actually weren't that atypical of all youth. You know, just struggles of getting a job. And in particular, this is, you know, now 2008, 2009, so things are going downhill with the economy. And we were really, we saw jobs that we had developed with the intervention evaporating in front of us. So we knew that some of that is not about disability. Some of that is bigger or larger than that and more societal. We still have qualitative work coming in, and we're still analyzing that and writing that together, but a lot of that has to do with the role that community plays in problem solving. So if you bring people together from diverse groups, and I don't mean racially and ethnically diverse necessarily, but more diverse in their roles in the community. Employers have very rarely been involved in interventions in special ed, and we wonder why that is, because people with disabilities have a lot of potential in staying in communities and providing work and things, you know, being contributing members of their communities. And then also there's some employer perception data that has yet to be analyzed. Again, we had a couple of papers that came out of that, and that is, whew, made it, got there.
Now you're rich, huh?
Yeah. I have no problems now. I'm relaxing on the beach, as you can see. But I think one of the things that if nothing else, tenure does provide you a very, very good opportunity, of course, to look at what you've done and where do you go from there. So from that, and in answer to the first couple of questions that I posed this afternoon, I started thinking about what are the implications of this for my own work? What does all this mean? And in part because there's a tension. You know, I put this qualitative stuff on the back burner. I worked very hard to think about myself as a good methodologist, and so in qualitative measures, and so methods. So part of it was what do I do with this, you know, and then I jumped into this other type of study, albeit collaboratively, and definitely Eric is the leader on all of our quantitative work. But what I wanted to think about really were some broader issues, maybe issues that Eric and I decided together that aren't about necessarily the tool itself, but how the study is designed and structured. And so, for example, in the random control experiment, I still have this issue of culture, and I'm worrying about equity. And I look at our study and I look at the participants, and I actually left the piece of paper in the office, but you know, we do have the control group and the experiment group mirror very nicely. It was a very tight study. But if you look at the numbers of youth who are participating from different groups, it is low. So the dominant group, European American kids, make up the large portion of that experimental and control group. And I think we could have probably a pretty lively discussion about representativeness, and then also how does a randomized control experiment account for diversity? It's complex. It's really difficult to think about. And we thought about it the whole time we were designing the study in the schools. You know, we designed in special ed, for those of you who are not in special ed, we don't get to go into a classroom and just say, hey, here's our study, pick up a sheet on your way out and take it to your parents, because we can't know who's in special ed. And so we have to have the teacher as the intervener in that sense. And that means they need to be trained for IRB and ethics. And then in this case, they have to be trained for a really complicated implementation of a design. And it was interesting. You know, we talked to teachers who would say, oh, I know, you've got to get so-and-so in your study. And we'd say, oh, no, random number generator, make sure you follow this. And you at some point have to let go of that control, because you don't have the right to know who is and who is not in special education until after they'd signed their release. And so that posed an interesting issue. Also, for the experiment, as you can imagine, the IRB letter is quite lengthy. We did translate it into Spanish. We had no returns from Spanish-speaking parents. And it wasn't surprising to me. It was very complicated. The other thing is that when we did the qualitative work, I call it high-speed qualitative methods, which is not, you know, desirable. So talking to those kids with learning disabilities or emotional and behavioral disabilities, that was talking to them one time. It was being in their classroom. In one case, we were in the classroom as much as possible. But in the other case, because of the travel time too, we were traveling and collecting data, maybe, you know, in some of the same days that they first met us. And anyone who does qualitative work understands that that compromises the lack of a relationship will compromise, at least in some part, the depth of the conversation. How exactly is another topic. But what it did give me, I think one of the things that these experiences did afford me was the ability to critique a little bit, to talk about the things that I'm talking about with you all in a scholarly way in papers. So one of the projects that I'm working on is I'm working with Iden Ball, and we are looking at developing a rubric for random control experiments that is culturally responsive. So thinking about, if you're really going to do this, if you're going to intervene, how can you do so in a culturally responsive way? What would that begin to mean? And so that's an interesting thing that we've been working on. I consider it to be really, really difficult, and hoping that the field will be open to it, because it really is suggesting a different epistemological stance for research, I think, that people might not be as familiar with hearing. And then as far as productivity, one of the things I had to do is, and I'll wrap this up really quick, just go back to the literature. You know, I felt like the pressures of productivity definitely made me work faster and harder, and sometimes that was onerous. So what I wanted to know when I went back to the literature is what supports us in this level of productivity. And it's interesting, Santo and colleagues talk a lot about supports and barriers, and I have to say that the supports that they list are really exactly what I had here in this context. And that's always, you know, debatable, but I would say mentoring, they mentioned formal and informal mentoring. I had awesome mentoring the whole time I was here. I especially felt that way in terms of informal mentoring, so people that I would seek out and ask and were very giving of their time, and I definitely appreciated that. Also, course releases, a big deal that they discuss in terms of, you know, but, you know, again, interestingly though, course releases are tied to that money thing. And so if small grants aren't enough to buy out, then that becomes, I did get a lot of course release from Project Summer, which was an intervention study, so that's not lost on me at all. Another interesting line of literature in this area is looking at NSF university research centers and the desire to produce commercially consumable research or applied research, and whether or not junior faculty feel good about pursuing those projects because of what they've heard about tenure. And so what the authors conclude is actually they don't. They pursue very traditional types of research because they're concerned that this type of research, commercially consumable and practically applicable, will not get them publications in the highest journals and therefore will not lead to tenure, which is a little bit of a different issue, but I do think it's related because we do have a lot of research centers and we also have a lot of really large grants. But then thinking about the implications for research also, just broader than that, I think is interesting. The calls from within the field right now, at least in special ed, there are two special issues coming out that are asking for a broader approach to say, you know, okay, randomized controlled design, it might be a gold standard, but you can never study an entire problem with only one method. And so really let's start thinking about expanding out again. Also, persisting inequities and conceptualizations of research as a cultural practice really needs a lot of thought, because we've done the randomized control design now for a long time. The randomized control design wasn't new in the beginning of the 2000s, right? But we have the same challenges. We have persistent inequity, and we have some of the exact same questions are still being asked. And so we have to wonder why that is. And then lastly, related concerns from outside the field. I think one of the most interesting lines of research that I've read recently is actually from the medical field, which is talking about the prejudice against the null hypothesis in the world of publications. And so what happens when a study doesn't get a significant finding, and therefore the authors say, I can't mess with that. I've got to focus my work on these significant findings, and what knowledge is being lost then. And perhaps we're losing an important window into a problem if we look at all of the findings, including those that are not statistically significant. So, how'd I do on time? Okay, yeah, I think there's enough time for questions, so if anyone wants to ask one, I'm happy to.
Looking at your presentation, and I've not seen Prezi before, it almost seems like it's a metaphor for your nonlinear track. And I wanted to ask, and Kimber, you might respond to this too, what kind of jeopardy is there in being kind of non-traditional and non-linear? And as we were putting your package together, I think your external letters, and you know, it was a different kind of a process in terms of conceptualizing a tenure package. And did you feel, were there junctures in time where you thought that you were in jeopardy because of kind of a non-traditional track, or the qualitative, or did you having difficulty with people resonating with that research? Or I guess
you know, I think probably I wouldn't say that I necessarily felt in jeopardy, but what I did think was very challenging was getting feedback from reviewers on the qualitative work that was so I'm at a loss for words, but it really revealed that the reviewer was not understanding qualitative methods. So one question that I got, I think, on every single paper is, why is your sample size so small? And it's just like, that's a pretty basic concept, and it doesn't mean that we who do qualitative work don't have to provide a rationale. Of course we do. If I have 3 people, I need to explain why I have 3 people. That isn't the issue. The issue, though, is the notion of too small was a bit off. Also, I would, when I first got out of grad school, I would write these really lengthy method sections, and my writing group is over there, so they're laughing. But the method sections, tended to really talk a lot about relationship, and reviewers did not like that in special ed. And I think there is some tension about the nature of epistemologies and whether or not science is unbiased. And from an interpretivist perspective, that is untenable. And so it doesn't mean that you can never ask a question and get a specific answer. It doesn't mean that, there's never a right or wrong, but it does mean that you're open to thinking about things in very complex, layered, and multi-perspective ways. And so that's really what was challenging, because I spent a lot of time answering questions that really probably shouldn't have been asked if the reviewer had known more about the methodology. Which is interesting, because one of the next projects that I'm working on is a qualitative research reviewer's guide with Beth Grau. And so what we're trying to do is lay out some quality indicators. But if you're on the woohoo qualitative side, you know that those quality indicators can be very controversial. And so, you're kind of trying to talk to 2 groups of people, and that's always tricky.
So I've had the privilege of reading so many of your papers, and one of the things that always surprised me whenever we discussed your work or our work is that the structural inequities were so much more prevalent and salient and so tangible when it came to special education. So I remember some of your examples of African American mothers like trying to navigate the system that some knew well, some didn't know so well. And teachers' sort of responses to how African American mothers came at the situation, and so it's always been really interesting to me. So I'm wondering, since you've examined parents' perspectives and teachers' perspectives, how do you think now about self-determination, which is equally interesting to me, which is part of your earlier work? So I'm just wondering, how you think about self-determination now. How you're thinking about it now, or if you plan to come back to it.
Yeah, I think it's an enduring, and I think for good reason, an enduring and promising idea or notion in special education. And in part, I think that strength is generated by the fact that the concept itself, in addition to emerging from literature or scholarship, also emerged from people with disabilities who said things like nothing about us without us. And so I think that self-determination is important. What I also think, though, is that people need to maybe broaden their understanding of what it is. So in special education, it's been largely whittled down to action. So things like making choices is a component of self-determination. Making decisions is a component. Knowing about one's disability. And that is again where there are some contestation. There are people who say, I don't have a disability. I don't know what you're talking about, but I know what I need. I need extra help, but I don't call that a disability. So some way to just sort of be a little bit more inclusive of the range of what it means to be self-determining. But it's not operationalized very well. I think it kind of hurts us in our field to operationalize it in such a decontextualized, practical way, even though it's really nice for teachers because they can open a book and it says, teach your kids to be self-determining, get them to write a pro and con list and make the best decision, for this question or whatever. And that's very useful. But I think it's along the lines of a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Teachers also have to understand the actions that they take that thwart self-determination in a moment-by-moment basis at an IEP meeting when they, say to someone, shh, or whatever. And I think a lot of teachers are aware of that, but still, it's complicated. And that doesn't also speak to the idea that parents have their own opinions about self-determination. And one of the things that interested me about this was that when I started reading the curricula, I thought my parents would flip out if I went to a parent conference as a child and did some of the things that those curricula were suggesting. That's just not the way that they didn't buy into that. So then what happens? You know, so I guess expanding, but I don't know that that's specific enough to answer your question.
Just curious what you thought about it.
Other comments or questions? Yeah.
I think an interesting irony that you've raised for me is the tension between the irony of the what works movement in special education being born out of an approach to children that is fundamentally about individualized education. So the tension between the IEP as an individualized education plan juxtaposed with an empirical movement for what works, which is actually fundamentally non-individualized, right? And about the greatest good for the most number of people. And that doesn't have to be intention, but I feel like, I just think that's really interesting, and I feel like I'm more, your work has made me more aware of that, and I always like that you continue to point that out, so I'm glad that you do, and hope that you will continue to do that.
Thank you. It's the, you know, IDEA has their own What Works website. So they do try to talk about what works. And some of those are procedural ideas that might be able to be, you know, really group focused. Not all of them are, you know, instructional, but the instructional ones, I think especially a lot of the work in the area of literacy is interesting for that reason. Any other comments or questions?
I have a kind of small question. It's very small. First, I just want to thank you for a great talk. At one point, you were talking about one of the studies about how it's the summer job readiness study, and you mentioned that teachers' expectations seem to trump the readiness skills that kids have. And I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about why you think the disjuncture is so pronounced between teachers' expectations and their notion of what the kids' readiness abilities were, or, you know, sort of skill sets were.
Well, the population in that particular study was kids with significant intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so I think that, you know, the teachers probably were focused on the day-to-day work of learning in a context, not all the time, but largely in a classroom-based context. And probably if we made sure, you know, it would be really interesting to do some qualitative work and find out what community-based teachers thought versus what classroom-based teachers thought. Because I think the community-based teachers that I know personally who did participate in the project, you know, really understood that the context was a lot for the student, and that, you know, things like riding the bus to work is something that the students could learn easily, and that could be a part of a plan to get a job. And so that, I think that probably accounted for at least
sort of classroom-based
right,
skills.
Right. A lot of the respondents were classroom-based teachers.
Thank you.
Good timing with your PowerPoint there. Thank you.
Thank you.